It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman. I am here at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art with Charles and Amanda Shepard, and here to talk about this, like our monthly Catholic art history lesson, and I've learned so much. So what are we going to learn about today?
Well, today we head to 15th century Florence to spend time learning about the life and the pioneering methods of Fra Angelico, who was called Fra Angelico after he died, which in Italian means angelic brother because of the very devout and pious life that he led. The name that he took as a Dominican friar was Fra Giovanni, but then, of course, after he died, was upheld as a very moral and devout monk.
Okay. So any art that we might be familiar with?
Yes, he was very prolific, and early on, he knew he had this artistic talent, and he likely trained in the workshop of Lorenzo Monaco, who was also a monk and the leading painter in Florence until his death in 1425. But then around 1418, so around the time that he joined this workshop, he joined the Dominican order, and the Dominicans quickly realized that they had this very talented painter on their hands and took advantage of his talent to promote their order and what they were preaching. Mm-hmm. So he was used to preach the gospel in a very visual way, which was edifying to the people. And what we can credit Brother Angelico for is his pioneering methods of realism and naturalism, which was a precursor to the Renaissance. In the 15th century, the Renaissance hadn't yet come into full bloom, which in a previous show we talked about the Renaissance being all about more beauty, more realism, more light, more depth of field, more perspective. Figures would have more volume and dimension to them, which I think created a more emotional and spiritual experience. And Brother Angelico was one of the first to do that in a very widespread way.
Huh. And a thing to think about, too, is that it's a real plus, I think, that Lorenzo Monaco was his teacher, because Lorenzo was a very serious and loyal monk, so he's setting a great example, and it's very consistent with how Fra Angelico wants to live his life and live his career. I think that's important. I think a thing that is slightly a holdback for him, though, is that Monaco is teaching the style that's coming just before this extra depth of field and just before enlivening everything, which, of course, mathematically they didn't know how to do yet. It would be a younger peer of Fra Angelico's, Masaccio, who was spending time at this point like calculating, how would I make that figure seem less flat? How could I move him in space? That said, though, I've always felt that these paintings that came just before that are very powerful and very moving in their simplicity. You're not getting caught up with the extras of the scene. You're focusing, there's the Annunciation, and you think, okay, that's pretty direct. I get that.
So Masaccio, who Charles is referring to, was another painter who influenced Brother Angelico. He died prematurely in 1428, which paved the way for Brother Angelico to be the most sought-after Florentine painter of the time. Around that same time, the Dominican order took over the convent in San Marco. And this was also the time of the Medici family ruling. And they commissioned Angelico to decorate the whole convent with frescoes, altarpieces, canvases, and, of course, all of them very important religious scenes. And he created frescoes within the cells that the monks would pray, and he included Dominican figures within the scene so that the monks could imagine themselves in the adoration of the Magi, in the resurrection or the crucifixion. And Also, because the cells were very dark, he created the paintings to exist in a dark environment to influence their prayer life. And you mentioned what are some of the works that we would know by this artist? The most reproduced work of art by Brother Angelico, Charles mentioned the Annunciation, is the one of 3 frescoes in the convent that's not within those cells. It's actually at the top of one of the staircases so that you would see it all the time in your daily business as a monk. And what Charles was saying about perspective is that this composition, it's actually one of the first paintings to show the Annunciation outside. In Gothic and medieval art, the Annunciation was shown within a room. And here we have Gabriel and Mary in sort of a courtyard scene.
Yeah.
And, we see some foliage and some grass and even a wooden fence and very almost geometric, mathematical perspective in this. It's kind of like a patio area. That's a contemporary word for what this is. We have these Romanesque columns with some ornamentation here, and yet with these shadows, we're seeing very dimensional architecture of this scene. So that was very new to painting at the time. That was a precursor to the Renaissance, where we have some depth, we have perspective. The angel has really nice light showing the volume of his body. The folds of his robe are very dimensional and almost tactile, like you could touch it.
Yeah.
In work before this, we would see the figures looking flat, almost unnatural, and their background would have been maybe a flat gold leaf, just color field, where we don't see into the painting. So even though this is simple, as Charles said, there's so much groundbreaking technique here that Brother Angelico can be credited for.
Because to take a step in this direction, post-Masaccio particularly, is scary in a way, because this sounds like it's going to work, but let's not take this too far, because it might not come out as well as we think. So let's get a little depth of field here. Getting it outdoors, I thought, was a phenomenal choice. Each of these Romanesque archways kind of frames the figures, and the spare adornment doesn't take anything away from either figure, and the radiance and the splendor of the garmentry of the angel tells you this is indeed an angel. This is very special, and a special thing is about to happen to this very simple person.
Right. There is some ornamentation, but Brother Angelico wouldn't have gone too far with the ornamentation and the flowing robes and linens, and there are no fine things in this painting, because that wouldn't have been in line with Dominican simplicity and the life of poverty and worship still at that time, and art at that time was meant to keep you focused on the scene, not the dressing of the scene. Also, in this particular painting, there is a very strong but unidentified light source coming to the angel and the Virgin, and that was also different. That was in contrast to medieval art. There wouldn't have been a clear light source in Gothic art. It was flat. You don't know if you were inside or outside, and maybe the gold leaf background would have illuminated your visuals as the viewer, but in this painting, we see illumination actually being included in the painting, and that's what gives the figures volume. That's what allows us to see the muscle formations of both the people and their faces seen in profile. We can see sort of around their faces rather than just seeing a flat shape. And that, I would say, allowed people to imagine the scene with more reality and make it more relevant to their lives.
And I think that is probably what we would come to expect now of some of this art, but this was kind of revolutionary at the time.
Yes. Oh, no, today, this, I think, even though it's revolutionary at the time, still looks simplistic to us today, because the standard in painting after the Renaissance was high academic style. And we've talked about this before. When we say academic style, we mean how good can you get? How skillfully can you represent this? And today, that's not revolutionary, as you said, but at the time, it was very new.
Yeah.
And it would have been very breathtaking at the time. Anybody coming to see this for the first time would think, wow, that's just not like anything I've ever seen before. And he's got two things to consider. The depth of his faith, number one, so he wants to be right about what he does. But the other thing is, as Amanda mentioned earlier, if he's right, they commission him to do all this other work throughout the grounds, and that's going to keep him working for years. So he wants to be breathtaking, but he doesn't want to scare anybody. So he's walking a very tight line in my mind.
And
he does it very well.
This work was painted around 1445, 1450, so it was one of his latest works because he died in 1455. So this would have been the peak of his talents.
Okay.
So kind of the pinnacle of the time.
Yeah. And like you said, it's one of his most famous pieces.
Yeah.
And really, if you look up a Google image search of the Annunciation, this is probably going to be one of the top 5 images, if not the first one that comes up.
Absolutely.
I've seen it on so many walls. We have that hanging up at Redeemer Radio on the wall. So very popular. And this is my untrained artist just tossing this out. But when you describe those pillars and the architecture of the building, I think, yes, it's simple, but it also looks very strong and hard in comparison to the figures that seem so vulnerable and fragile and humble.
That's a very astute observation. I would agree with you completely.
You
got some points.
You got it. And it alludes to the fact in my mind that what's about to happen is going to endure.
Yeah.
You can take comfort in that. This is going to be the most special thing, and it will endure.
And while it's outside, it's still protected.
It's still protected, and yes, I would agree with you. And they also, when you look at this, they occupy their own section of the patio, if you will.
Yeah.
Between the angel and the virgin is one of these columns, and yet you don't feel as though it's blocking the two figures, but they occupy their own special place, sort of under the protection of what would have been seen as a respected institution. I think that this is symbolic of the church being the highest institution.
Yeah. All right. Well, as always, I've learned a lot, and I've seen this painting so much. I've never really looked at it that closely, so it's a good.
And I want to add one more thing, that Fra Angelico was declared the patron saint of artists in 1984 by Pope John Paul II. So
there you go.
He is canonized and is watching over artists everywhere.
Very good. Good to know. All right. Well, before we go, what else is going on with the Fort Wayne Museum of Art?
Well, for music lovers out there, we have an exhibition of guitars from medieval to metals. So the history and evolution of guitars, that's through January 6th. And then a large glass sculpture, Repose in Amber, that is a whole immersive experience into sculpture and glass, and that's on long-term display.
It's amazing too. Definitely come and check that out. FWMOA.org.
Correct.
And social media, FWMOA as well.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Charles and Amanda Shepard from the Fort Wayne Museum of Art, for my monthly art history lesson. Appreciate it.
Kyle, thank you.